Structural change models are models that attempt to explain the change in the structural makeup, the mix of sectors and industries that takes place during the process of development. The models often explain how developing economies go from being based on traditional subsistence agriculture to becoming a more diverse economy with a focus on manufacturing industries. These models have many similarities to other ideas and models. For example, just as in the Rostow stages of growth model and the Harrod-Domar model, capital accumulation is an important aspect of structural change models. Investment is still important. Also, the Rostow stages of growth model and the Harrod-Domar model are very aggregate models. They focus on the entire economy, but the structural change model is a bit more disaggregated because it considers different sectors of the economy. So where the Harrod-Domar model connects capital accumulation to the growth in total output, the structural change models attempt to provide some insights into how the output growth actually occurs. And their main answer is that developing economies go from being based on agriculture to becoming more industrialized, and that switch makes the economy more productive. We also remember that Rostow indicated that one characteristic of the takeoff stage was that over time industrialization increases and more workers switch from agriculture to manufacturing. And the structural change models really attempt to explain that movement of labor. Another characteristic of Rostow's takeoff stage was that investment would lead to sustainable growth. And one particular structural change model, called the Lewis two-sector model, argues that reinvestment of profit from the modern sector provides the necessary level of investment that produces sustainable growth. Although the structural change models do add to our understanding of development, they're not perfect. They are based on a few dubious assumptions, and they often fail to account for country differences. Nevertheless, although they don't explain everything, they are still very useful. And it's worth noting that the most famous structural change model, which was the Lewis two-sector model, led Arthur Lewis to winning the Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences in 1979. As a side note, Sir William Arthur Lewis was born on St. Lucia, a small island in the West Indies, in 1915, and he died in 1991. An interesting story is that Lewis wanted to become an engineer, but he switched to economics because the government and the companies of British colonies, such as St. Lucia, refused to hire blacks. Lewis went to study at the London School of Economics instead, where he was the first black individual to ever gain acceptance. And eventually Arthur Lewis ended up being professor of political economy at Princeton University. He was an economic advisor to many African and Caribbean countries. Alright, back to structural change models. A subcategory of the structural change models is called the pattern of development analysis. And that is based on statistical or econometric analysis of developing countries' experiences. It is therefore similar to the Rostow stages of growth model, since it tries to figure out how developing nations proceed through different stages of development. In particular, how does a developing nation actually move from a traditional agricultural sector to having a greater emphasis on the modern industrial production? Or how does consumer behavior change in the course of development? Just like the Harrod-Domar model and the Rostow model, the patterns of development analysis views saving and investment as a necessary condition for economic growth and structural change. However, in contrast to Harrod-Domar, saving and investment is not considered to be a sufficient condition for development to occur. In fact, patterns of development analysis points towards several factors, in addition to saving and investment, that are important and required to achieve economic development. And some examples were structural change, of course, from agriculture to industry, but also greater international trade, change in consumer demand towards consumer goods, urbanization, and a whole list of things. And one important thing, according to Patterns of Development, that makes contemporary developing countries different from countries that developed in the past is the fact that the international framework, the global economy, is so different today compared to the past. In fact, according to Patterns of Development, there are both domestic and international or external constraints to development. This is different from Harry DeMar that focuses only on an internal capital constraint. Furthermore, structural change models and patterns of development analysis are very optimistic. That is, they believe that we can identify development constraints and then we can adopt domestic policies to overcome these constraints, and therefore we can reach higher levels of development. I actually want to highlight that the addition to external constraints in the patterns of development analysis was really important. And it previews a future model that we will be looking at, namely the international dependency theory. International dependency theory is, however, less optimistic. In fact, it is downright pessimistic. And it focuses on the notion that external constraints are holding developing countries back, preventing them from reaching higher levels of income.